For most of human history, death was a public spectacle. Crowds gathered. Laws were enforced not just through punishment, but through theater. And the methods chosen weren't just about ending life. They were carefully designed to send messages about power, morality, and order. Today, we're examining the historical practices of capital punishment across centuries. This isn't about sensationalism. It's about understanding how societies once defined justice and why these practices eventually disappeared. Welcome back. Before we begin, a brief content note. This video discusses historical execution methods in educational context. We'll avoid graphic descriptions, but the subject matter is inherently serious. Our goal is historical understanding, not shock value. Capital punishment has existed in nearly every civilization, but the methods used and the reasons behind them reveal fascinating insights about legal systems, religious beliefs, social hierarchies, and evolving concepts of humanity. From ancient Rome to medieval Europe, from imperial China to colonial America, execution wasn't simply about death. It was communication. The method chosen often reflected the crime. The location, public square versus private chamber, reflected who needed to witness it. The rituals surrounding it reflected what society valued: order, deterrence, religious salvation, or political dominance. So let's walk through history's most significant execution methods, understand their context, and explore why they ultimately vanished. Let's start with beheading, perhaps the most widespread method across cultures and centuries. From the Roman Empire to revolutionary France, decapitation was often reserved for nobility. Why? Because it was considered swift and honorable compared to alternatives. The sword was the weapon of warriors and aristocrats. In medieval Europe, being executed by blade rather than by hanging marked you as someone of status, even in death. When Anne Boleyn faced execution in 1536, King Henry VIII commissioned an expert swordsman from France rather than using the standard axe, a final gesture of respect, however grim. The guillotine, invented in 1789, represented Enlightenment thinking applied to execution. Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin argued for a device that would execute all criminals equally, regardless of class, and do so with mechanical efficiency. The guillotine became synonymous with the French Revolution, but its inventors intended it as humanitarian reform. It remained France's official execution method until capital punishment was abolished there in 1981. In feudal Japan, decapitation by katana was part of the samurai code. A skilled executioner could perform the task in a single stroke, considered both art and duty. Context mattered. Execution could restore family honor or serve as political statement during the shogunate period. Hanging became the dominant method in English-speaking countries for centuries. It was cheap, required no specialized equipment, and could be performed in any town square. But its simplicity concealed complex social purposes. Public hangings in England, particularly at London's Tyburn Tree, drew enormous crowds through the 18th century. These weren't just executions. They were civic events. Vendors sold food and pamphlets. Spectators numbered in the thousands. The condemned often gave final speeches, which were recorded and distributed. These last dying speeches served as moral lessons, warnings, or sometimes acts of defiance. The crimes that led to hanging tell us about societal priorities. In 18th century Britain, over 200 offenses carried the death penalty, including theft of goods worth more than a shilling. Property was sacred. The bloody code protected wealth through terror. Reformers eventually recognized this was counterproductive. Juries refused to convict when the punishment seemed disproportionate, undermining the law itself. Technical variations existed. Short drop hanging caused death by strangulation over several minutes. The long drop, calculated by weight, aimed for quicker death by vertebral fracture. Another attempt at making execution more humane while maintaining the practice. Public hangings ended in Britain in 1868, not because execution itself was questioned, but because the crowds had become unruly, and the spectacle seemed to brutalize rather than educate the public. Some crimes were considered so severe that societies designed methods specifically to demonstrate maximum condemnation. These practices were primarily medieval and early modern European, though parallel forms existed in other regions. Drawing and quartering was England's prescribed punishment for high treason, betrayal of the crown. The process involved multiple stages designed to maximize both suffering and symbolic destruction of the traitor's body. It was public, ritualized, and explicitly intended to deter political opposition through horror. The last person subjected to this full punishment in England was executed in 1820, though the sentence remained on the books until 1870. Its gradual abandonment reflected changing sensibilities about state power and acceptable levels of violence, even against convicted traitors. Burning was used across Europe, particularly for religious crimes, heresy, witchcraft, or violations of doctrinal law. The association with fire had theological significance in Christian contexts, purification, or earthly preview of damnation. Joan of Arc's execution in 1431 exemplifies how burning was used against religious dissidents. These intensified methods eventually disappeared as concepts of proportionate justice evolved and religious justifications for state violence weakened during the Enlightenment. Crucifixion, most famous from Roman history, was reserved for slaves, rebels, and non-citizens, people outside the protection of Roman law. It was designed to be slow, public, and humiliating. Victims were often displayed at crossroads or high-traffic areas as warnings. The method's historical significance extends beyond individual executions. Crucifixion marked social boundaries. Who had rights? Who didn't? And what happened when you challenged the empire? When Rome crucified thousands of Spartacus's followers along the Appian Way in 71 BCE, it was mass communication through terror. Rome banned crucifixion in the 4th century CE as Christianity became the imperial religion, unable to maintain a punishment so associated with Christ's death. Similarly, impalement was used in various cultures, most infamously by Vlad III of Wallachia in the 15th century, as psychological warfare. Historical records suggest Vlad displayed victims to intimidate Ottoman invaders. The method's horror was strategic, reputation as deterrent. These methods shared a common function. They defined in-groups and out-groups, demonstrated who held power, and used suffering as political message. The 19th and 20th centuries brought attempts to make execution more scientific and less brutal. though they maintained capital punishment itself. The electric chair, introduced in New York in 1890, was promoted as instantaneous and painless compared to hanging. Early proponents argued electricity represented modern progressive justice. The reality was more complicated. Malfunctions occurred, and debates about suffering continued. Gas chambers emerged in the 1920s in the United States, again marketed as more humane. Lethal injection followed in 1982, designed to resemble medical procedure rather than violent death. Each innovation claimed to remove cruelty from execution while preserving the state's power to kill. Critics argued these were aesthetic changes that obscured rather than resolved fundamental questions about capital punishment's morality and effectiveness. The decline of execution methods mirrors the decline of execution itself. Today, more than 2/3 of countries have abolished capital punishment in law or practice. The movement gained momentum after World War II. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 emphasized inherent human dignity. European countries began abolishing capital punishment through the 1960s to 80s. The last execution in the UK occurred in 1964. France followed in 1981. Arguments for abolition emphasized several points: the irreversibility of mistakes, evidence that execution doesn't deter crime more effectively than imprisonment, the discriminatory application based on race and class, and philosophical positions about state power and human rights. In countries that maintain capital punishment, methods have generally shifted toward those perceived as less violent. Lethal injection dominates in the United States. A few countries retain shooting or hanging. So, what have we learned from this journey through history's darkest legal practices? First, that execution methods weren't arbitrary. They reflected specific cultural values, legal theories, and power structures. The method chosen told a story about the crime, the criminal, and the society passing judgment. Second, that the concept of humane execution is itself paradoxical. Each generation believed it had found a less cruel alternative, only for the next generation to reject that method as barbaric. This progression suggests something deeper, growing unease with the practice itself. Third, that public spectacle was central to execution's purpose for most of history. When societies moved executions behind prison walls, they fundamentally changed the institution, acknowledging shame or discomfort with what was being done in their name. Today's debates about capital punishment continue these historical conversations. The questions remain: what does justice require? What does human dignity demand? And what do our answers reveal about who we are as societies? History doesn't provide simple answers, but understanding where we've been helps us think more clearly about where we're going. Thanks for watching. If you found this educational, please like and subscribe. And remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding ourselves